The orphanage sat atop a dry rise of red clay in eastern Georgia, some 3 crooked miles from the Savannah River, and 5 lonely miles from the nearest church bell that dared to ring on Sundays if it rang at all, for even the wind seemed hesitant to pass over Marrow Hill, which stood like a stubborn tooth jutting from the mouth of the earth, hard and aching, and hidden with rot beneath its surface. The locals, mostly farmers and devout Baptists with hands calloused from toil and eyes trained not to wander into shadowed thoughts, called it Marrow Hill. Not because it was named on any map or deed, but because of what had once been whispered to rest beneath it, long before the stone walls of the orphanage were laid, before even the first cotton root took hold in the soil. The native tribes avoided the hill and gave no explanation, only silence, which was ironic given that silence would become the hill's most famous trait, its signature curse, its quiet confession that something was wrong and had always been wrong, and when Reverend Morse, a stiff-jawed widower with gray brows like wings of ash, opened the Marrow Hill Orphan Asylum in 1761 under the sponsorship of the Georgia Society for Christian Virtue and the Deaf, few questioned why such a remote, windless patch of land had been chosen to house 22 children who could not hear, could not speak, and according to some whispers, could no longer dream without trembling. Children taken in from across the colonies, plucked from port cities and mountain villages alike. Each of them deaf from birth, abandoned not because they lacked worth, but because they were said to carry a strange calm with them, a kind of unbreakable quiet that made even the boldest dogs avoid their scent. And over the years, the town of Pine Hollow, 6 miles west of Marrow Hill, began to quietly dread the sight of the Reverend's cart rattling through its center, for each visit meant another deaf child taken away up the red road, seated quietly beside Morse like a lamb who could not cry out and did not know it was being led away forever. The building itself was made of quarried stone, thick and low, with iron-barred windows and a chapel whose bell had never rung. Not once, and where the children were made to sit in rows and mimic the shape of hymns with their mouths, hymns they could not hear but had memorized from the movement of Morse's lips and the fury of his hands when one of them missed a beat, and those same hands, always trembling slightly at the knuckles as if fighting some inner cold, would gently place their fingers beneath the children's chins, lifting their faces with mechanical kindness, and mouth the words, "God hears you," even though the children, by nature or by trauma, did not speak. Nor did they sign in the standard method taught by civilized schools in Boston or Charleston. They had their own way, a motion language that seemed too fluid, too synchronized, like leaves in windless air, and some of the elder children were said to respond to gestures before they were made, turning their heads or raising their hands before the sign reached their sight, as though they could hear with something other than ears. Reverend Morse believed he was saving souls, that each mute mouth was a silent chapel unto itself, and so he prayed not with voice, but with presence, standing among the children each morning at dawn in the red clay yard and mouthing entire psalms as the children mirrored him with blank eyes, moving lips, and synchronized stillness that unsettled even the groundskeeper, a half-blind Frenchman named Emile, who drank heavily and swore he once found the children out in the yard at midnight, all of them facing north and kneeling in the dirt, their fingers pressed to the soil and their eyes wide open. And when he shouted at them to return inside, not a single child flinched or turned. They simply remained still as statues until he fled to the chapel and spent the night locked inside, murmuring apologies to the Virgin Mary. There were rumors, of course, that the children were not entirely orphaned, that some had been taken from families who feared them, and one girl, the eldest, named Clara, was said to have been delivered by a Hessian soldier who claimed she had been born during an eclipse and had not cried once in her entire life, not even when her mother died in childbirth, and that wherever she walked, birds fell silent and dogs fled, and she became something of a leader among the children, her signing sharper, faster, and more complex than the rest, as though she had been taught by something unseen, and it was she who supposedly began drawing symbols on the chapel floor. Circles within circles, lines without angles, and a shape resembling a closed eye surrounded by flames. These symbols were scrubbed away daily by Reverend Morse, who grew increasingly gaunt in those final months, his sermons quieter, his prayers more desperate, as though some looming presence had moved into the cracks of the orphanage's stone and whispered through the mortar. And the children, though deaf, seemed to respond to these silent hauntings, often waking in unison in the night and walking together down the hall in perfect synchronization, only to be found standing before the locked door of the chapel, eyes closed, lips moving without sound, and their hands moving together in patterns no adult could decipher, until the night of June 2nd, 1703, a night remembered not for a storm or disaster but for its unnatural stillness, for the sky remained clear, the moon full, the air dry and heavy like a held breath. And yet, somehow, by morning, all 22 children were gone. Not missing in the conventional sense, for nothing was broken. No footprints led away from the orphanage. No carts were taken. No beds were disturbed. In fact, every child's bed was made perfectly, as if they had risen without disturbing a wrinkle, and on each pillow lay a black stone, smooth, cold, and carved with a strange notch that no local smith could replicate, a mark that did not seem chiseled but grown into the stone itself. The sheriff of Pine Hollow, a man named Tobias Green, who had fought in 2 frontier wars and seen men torn apart by bear and bullet, reportedly wept when he saw the dormitory, not because of the silence, but because of the profound sense that something final had occurred, that something had been completed, and when he entered the chapel at last, expecting to find Reverend Morse praying or hiding, or perhaps gone mad, he found him on the altar steps, eyes open, mouth agape, with his tongue removed cleanly from his mouth and replaced not with cloth or coin, but with a sliver of what appeared to be bone, smooth and thin, like a child's rib sharpened to a point. And though no blood stained his robe, Morse was undeniably dead, his hands curled against his chest in the shape of prayer, his expression not one of terror but awe, as though in his final moment he had seen something too enormous to describe. And perhaps he had, for no one in Pine Hollow ever dared open the orphanage again, and though it was never officially condemned, no buyer ever came. And slowly the building was taken back by vines and insects. The stones weathered and the windows shattered. But strangely, the chapel bell, though never hung, was found lying on its side in the tall grass, untouched by rust, and perfectly intact. And each year on June 2nd, no matter the weather, the townsfolk reported hearing a low, distant humming at midnight, as though the hill itself remembered what had happened, as though the silence of the children still echoed beneath the clay, waiting. 3 weeks after the silence fell like a closed curtain over Marrow Hill, the people of Pine Hollow came to a quiet, shivering consensus, not through town meetings or church sermons, but through unspoken gestures and glances exchanged over market stalls and muddy roads, that the orphanage must not be touched, not questioned, not entered again, and so it was seal-oiled, not with nails or guards, but with neglect, and in that neglect something deeper took root, something that filled the air around the place with a kind of pressure, like the heavy breath before a scream that never comes. No one dared to walk past it at night, and even in daylight travelers turned their carts away, the horses growing skittish long before the gates came into view, and those who lingered too near claimed they could feel a faint hum rising from the earth. Not loud or threatening, but consistent and unrelenting, like a sound too old and too low to name. Yet it wasn't the humming that broke the town, not entirely, but what began arriving in July, when the Georgia air hung thick and wet, and thunderclouds prowled the sky but never wept. They came as messages, if they could be called that, but without postage, without envelope, without author, just thin, yellowing sheets of paper, some crumpled, some damp, but all marked by soot, and all carrying the same single drawing. A child's face sketched with a frantic, almost trembling hand, eyes wide and fixed as if in recognition, and the mouth sewn shut with thick X's that gave the impression of silence held in place by violence, not by nature. These strange letters began appearing first at First Baptist Church, stuffed into hymnals, wedged beneath pews, even fluttering down from the bell tower like ashen leaves, and then in places they could not have been, slipped into the middles of fresh-baked loaves at the baker's, folded between the pages of sermons that had been locked in the vestry, and once, most disturbingly, nailed to the underside of the altar table in the chapel of Reverend Amos Bridge, the man appointed to succeed the late Reverend Morse and tasked with restoring moral order to a region now tainted by whispers and trembling prayers. Reverend Bridge had come from Augusta, a man of strict doctrine and louder faith, one who believed silence was weakness, and preached with such volume that even the deaf in his congregation claimed to feel the fire of his voice in their bones. But all that volume drained from him one particular night in mid-July, when his wife Martha awoke to find him standing at the window, fully clothed though it was well past midnight, his hands limp at his sides, eyes wide and filled with the same distant terror seen men in those child sketches. And when she asked him what he was doing, he didn't answer, didn't even blink, and only when she stepped closer did she hear the sound he was transfixed by. Not the wind, not the usual night chirr, but a humming, faint yet harmonic, a kind of layered tone that seemed to move in waves like breath against a hollow reed. And later, when she shook him and he finally turned, she realized he was no longer hearing anything at all. He had gone completely deaf, his ears uninjured, his mind intact. But something had been taken, cleanly and completely, as if a string within him had been cut with invisible shears, and all he could do was mouth the word choir again and again, a word he claimed to have heard in his dream, and again while awake. A sound like children singing not with voices but with pressure and light. After this, fear turned to panic in Pine Hollow, and people began locking their doors in ways they never had before, hanging crosses over their barns, refusing to eat bread that wasn't baked in their own homes. And yet the letters kept coming, slipped through shutters, appearing in school books, one even tucked inside a cradle where no adult had entered the room, and each one bore a new drawing, always the same face, always with stitched lips, but with subtle variations. A teardrop under one eye, a background of tangled roots, hands wreathed, as if signing something only the paper understood. And as the town's desperation grew, so too did the rumors, rising from the mouths of the old women who remembered things too long, and from the journals of a traveling German preacher who had visited the region years prior, and made note of a midwife who stayed in Pine Hollow briefly, a woman named Eliska Zorin, who spoke in riddles, wore no shoes, and claimed to have come from Moravia, a region in Eastern Europe known not only for its superstitions, but for an old rite involving silence, soil, and children. Specifically, those born deaf, whom they believed were unburdened by the noise of original sin, and therefore capable of hearing not the world, but the truth beneath it. Eliska had vanished in 1760, shortly after visiting the site that would become Marrow Hill, and though no one knew where she went, a few recalled seeing her walk up the clay hill at dusk and never come back down. And one old man swore she placed a black stone on the ground before disappearing into the trees, which only gained meaning years later when those same stones appeared on the pillows of the missing orphans. By August, the county governor sent a small team to investigate the claims, mostly to quiet the hysteria, and among them was a young clerk named Elijah Granger, an indentured laborer turned bureaucrat who had grown up just outside of Pine Hollow and had once, as a teenager, delivered milk to Marrow Hill every Friday morning, an experience he had refused to speak of until this moment, when the pressure of guilt, grief, and a tight noose of suspicion around his name drove him to confession. Under the flicker of lantern light in the back room of the constable's house, Granger spoke of what he had seen at the orphanage, not just once, but many times, describing how he, Reverend Morse, would gather the children not in the chapel, but in a hidden cellar beneath it, accessible only through a trapdoor behind the pulpit, and down there, in the cool dirt and dust, he would arrange them in a perfect circle, their backs straight, eyes open, and palms pressed against the bare soil, and how Morse would walk among them, whispering not words but tones, long, low hums, which the children would echo not with sound, but with movement, their fingers twitching, their bodies shivering in synchrony, as though the hums were not sounds but frequencies they could feel. He said he once saw Clara, the oldest girl, place her ear directly to the dirt and begin to smile. Not the way a child smiles at joy, but the way a prophet smiles at recognition. And he swore that sometimes, in the stillness, the ground would answer, that the dust would vibrate, that patterns would emerge in the floor as if drawn by invisible hands, and that the children would begin to rock slightly, their mouths open but no sound escaping, as if singing without air. And on the final morning of his deliveries, the week before the children vanished, he claimed to have arrived early before dawn, and instead of the usual quiet greeting from Reverend Morse, he heard nothing at all, just silence so thick it rang in his skull, and when he peered into the chapel through a cracked shutter, he saw all 22 children lying flat on the floor in a spiral pattern, not moving, not breathing, and Morse standing over them with his hands raised, tears streaming down his face, his lips moving silently, as though conducting a mass that required no sound and no audience beyond the dirt itself. Elijah fled that morning and never returned, fearing not punishment but memory itself, and now, in the glow of lantern light, his confession was taken down in full, sealed in an official logbook, and then quietly burned, the next day by the sheriff, who declared him mad. But madness did not explain what continued to happen in Pine Hollow, where 2 children were born deaf in the following months, despite no family history, and both were found at separate times in their sleep making motions with their fingers identical to those recorded in the signs used at Marrow Hill, even though neither had been taught any language at all. And one mother swore that her infant, only 9 months old, smiled at a patch of soil behind the church where nothing had ever grown, then began to hum, not audibly, but with his chest, a rhythmic pulsing, as if something deep beneath the crib had stirred and the child, in its voicelessness, recognized it. And slowly, as summer bled into fall, the entire region seemed to withdraw, fields producing less, birds migrating early, dogs howling at night without provocation, and people began moving away in quiet caravans, abandoning farms passed down for generations, unwilling to speak of why they left but grateful to leave it behind. And yet the orphanage remained, untouched, unburned, and wholly intact, like a tomb left to honor something no one dared name, its stones holding the last echo of children who had once been too silent for this world, and perhaps too tuned to another. A world beneath the soil, beneath language, beneath explanation, where choir was not song, but structure, and sound was not heard, but felt. In the spring of 1804, long after the stormless night that had swallowed the 22 deaf children without trace or tremor, long after the chapel bell rusted silently into the clay, and the forest began to reclaim what the townspeople had learned to avoid even in dreams, a team of British land surveyors working under the newly drawn maps of the post-revolutionary frontier stumbled across the orphanage at Marrow Hill, not by intention, but by error, their charts misaligned, their route twisted by weather and misfortune, until the overgrown silhouette of the stone building emerged like a bruised tooth from the soil, half consumed by vine and silence alik. They were 4 in number, 2 Scotsmen and 2 men from Essex, all under the employ of a land registry company tasked with confirming settlement boundaries and resource allocations, none of whom had any knowledge of what the land had once held, nor the stories that clung to it like mold behind the walls of memory. The men approached the orphanage not with reverence or fear, but with the pragmatic curiosity of engineers, and when they breached the warped doors and entered the main hall, they found the interior hauntingly preserved. Dust-coated furniture still arranged as if in use, books still stacked on a teacher's desk whose drawer, when opened, revealed a folded sheet of paper, brittle, cracked, but still bearing the image of 22 stick figures standing in a spiral, each drawn with deliberate lines and wide, empty eyes, and at the center, not a cross or a sun, but a simple black circle, heavy with implication. Intrigued, the team began to measure the foundation, noting irregularities beneath the chapel floor, and though the earth had long since begun to eat the walls, the stone beneath the pulpit rang hollow when struck with a boot heel, prompting the men to dig. First with tools, then with hands, as if some primitive urgency had taken hold, and after several feet of clay and rot, they uncovered a round iron hatch sealed it not with locks, but with what appeared to be melted wax and ash. Breaking through, they descended into a chamber that no plan had recorded, no county document described, a space untouched by time or moisture, a perfect circle lined in scorched limestone. The air within so still and so cold, it seemed to exist separate from the world above. And at its heart stood a pedestal of black slate, atop which sat 22 identical stones, each small enough to fit in a child's palm, each smooth and cold, each marked with a strange carved notch that no ISO could replicate, as if the marks had formed naturally, grown from within. And when the surveyors moved closer, they described a pressure in their ears, not a sound, but its ghost, a presence that tightened the skull and blurred the edge of thought, and though they catalogued the room and sketched its dimensions, none of them slept that night. Not because of fear, but because when they closed their eyes, they saw faces childlike, pale, unmoving, watching from behind the lids of sleep like silhouettes pressed into cloth. And one man, John McCulloch, claimed to have heard them, not with ears, but with the meat of his bones, a rhythmic pulse like breathing beneath the ground, as if something enormous and unseen slept far below the chamber floor and was now stirring in response to their intrusion. They sealed the hatch the next day, marking its location and swearing to report it to the magistrate in Savannah, but that report was never filed. For within 2 weeks, each man had succumbed to what the local papers described as declining temperament and loss of speech, beginning with temporary muteness and escalating to full psychological collapse, save for one, Edward Brimley, who survived long enough to flee back to England, where he was found hanged in his uncle's barn in Kent, a phrase scrawled across the wooden beams in soot-blackened charcoal. They never screamed, and beneath it 22 tally marks, each ending in a downward curve like a falling note. Word of the incident was quietly buried, and the Georgia Registry deemed Marrow Hill a null point, advising all future mappers to exclude it from public record due to terrain instability. But rumors do not obey official language, and within a year stories began to leak of children waking in the night without memory, their hands shaped in unfamiliar signs, of livestock refusing to pass near the hill's perimeter, of travelers losing hours or days when skirting too close to the ruins, as if time itself fractured in its shadow. And then came the dreams, first among the old families of Pine Hollow, those few who had stayed behind, passed down properties like curses, and remembered the silence that followed the orphanage's fall. They spoke of waking to the sensation of weight on their chests, of small footsteps pacing beside their beds, of faint vibrations in the floorboards that stopped the moment they moved, and always, always the image of a spiral, drawn in condensation on windows, in spilled flour on kitchen tables, in the ash of morning fires. By 1810, the last family in the region abandoned their land after their youngest son, born deaf, began drawing complex diagrams in the dirt of their barn floor, symbols that matched those recorded in the margins of the Morse's personal Bible, now held in a locked drawer in Savannah's Episcopal archives, pages warped by time and marked with frantic Latin phrases scrawled between verses, none of which translated fully, but all implying one recurring theme. They are beneath the silence. By then, the region around Marrow Hill had begun to rot in earnest. Trees refused to grow within a quarter-mile radius. Birds avoided the skies above it. And when thunderstorms rolled across Georgia, they passed over the hill without a drop, as if rain itself respected the deadness of the place. This anomaly was first noted in 1812 by a Methodist pastor named Walter Ives, who conducted a brief sermon near the hill to cleanse the stain of abandonment, and though his journal records clear skies before he began, his companions later swore that clouds had gathered only to circle the hill in a wide, windless ring never touching it, and that the pastor collapsed mid-prayer, clutching his ears, blood leaking from his nose, muttering, "The choir has roots," before slipping into a coma from which he never awoke. Thereafter, the phenomenon became known as the Hushed Acre, a dead zone of earth where sound faded strangely and weather recoiled, where compasses lost their bearing and cattle fell ill, and though the government tried twice to reclaim the land, once for military training, once for a railway, they were met each time with sudden, inexplicable tragedies. Surveying teams struck mute, tools rusting overnight, and, in one case, a fire that burned without smoke for 2 days before vanishing entirely, leaving only scorched soil shaped in overlapping spirals. And still, despite this, the land refused to be forgotten. For every few decades, a child is born near it who cannot hear. And though their parents are often of healthy lineage, these children display strange behaviors, waking at night with dirt beneath their fingernails, drawing symbols they have not seen, and sometimes weeping not from pain but from overwhelming awe, as if listening to something too enormous, too ancient, and too deep for any language to hold. And these children, though deaf, often begin to move in perfect rhythm with one another when placed in proximity, their gestures synchronizing as if following a silent conductor, until, one by one, they begin to fall mute entirely, not from birth defect, but from refusal, as if something within them has turned away from the outer world and chosen instead to listen inwardly, downwardly, toward something still speaking beneath the bones of the earth. The most recent of these cases occurred in 1899, when a girl named Adeline Moore was born in a farmhouse 15 miles east of Marrow Hill, and by age 5 she had taught herself to carve spirals into the wood of her bedroom floor using only her fingernails, and when questioned she said simply, "They told me." And when her father asked who, she looked past him, out the window, toward the ridge where no trees grew, and whispered, though she was deaf, "The ones who never screamed." She disappeared 2 weeks later during a dry lightning storm, her bed empty, her window closed, the only sign of her presence being a ring of black stones laid perfectly on the barn floor, each marked with a notch, each cold to the touch even in summer heat. Her disappearance was never investigated. Ted, beyond a cursory report, filed and forgotten, as all reports concerning the hill eventually were, and so the silence holds. Even now, in the 20th century, when maps have grown precise and science has lit nearly every corner of the dark, there remains on certain cartographer charts a blank space, unmarked, unnamed, where rain does not fall and birds do not fly, and though satellites may pass overhead and geologists may drill nearby, they always find something wrong with their data, an absence where presence should be, a resonance too deep to track, like a voice humming in frequencies no ear can hold, but every spine can feel. And so Marrow Hill stands still, swallowed in vines and memory, holding within it the silence of 22 children who vanished without violence, without struggle, but not without purpose. For if the spiral is a key, and silence is the door, then what lies beneath is not death, but something older, something that listens still, waiting for the next generation of voices brave enough to vanish, not into screams, but into songless obedience.